Following is my first paragraph of the script. Act as an scriptwriter expert who have 20 years experience in script writing and rewrite this paragraph more humanized and engaging and well hooked. Also add call to action in the end of this paragraph. With these lines, which city of the United States you are watching from, drop a comment and share with us if you have any confrontation with the HOA. We will narrate your story on our channel. Don't try to short the paragraph, just rewrite it in an engaging way with the same length, except she was dead serious. Tyler noticed her too and whispered under his breath, "Dude, what is that?" I had to bite my lip to keep from laughing because the sight was honestly absurd. She marched across her lawn and right up to where we were unloading boxes, her slippers making soft, shuffling sounds on the pavement. "Excuse me?" she said in a voice that was trying way too hard to sound authoritative, "but I need to know exactly what's going on here." Her eyes were darting between Tyler, me, and the moving truck, like she was some kind of detective investigating a major crime scene. What made it worse was how she started examining our stuff like she had every right to inspect it. She peered into the truck, pointing at my gaming chair with obvious disapproval, then moved to criticize the way we'd stacked boxes on my front porch. "That furniture doesn't look appropriate for this neighborhood," she announced, gesturing at my perfectly normal desk setup like it was some kind of contraband. I felt my stomach drop as the reality hit me. This wasn't just a curious neighbor introducing herself. This was someone who genuinely believed she had authority over what I could bring into my own home. The violation felt immediate and personal. Here I was experiencing what should have been one of the happiest moments of my life. And this stranger in pajamas was making me feel like I was doing something wrong just by existing in my own space. Tyler caught my eye and I could see he was thinking the same thing. This woman was seriously overstepping boundaries in a way that felt almost predatory. I set down the box I was carrying and gave her my friendliest smile, hoping to diffuse whatever weird energy she was bringing. "Hi there, I'm Ben Harrison. I just bought this house and we're moving my stuff in today. Beautiful neighborhood you have here." I figured this was just a case of a concerned neighbor wanting to make sure everything was legitimate, which I totally understood. But instead of the warm welcome I was expecting, Hannah's expression got even more suspicious. "I'm going to need to see some proper documentation," she announced, holding up that clipboard like she was a government official. "Anyone can have keys made. I'm Hannah Miller, and I represent the Homeowners Association here. We take security very seriously in Willowbrook Gardens. Apparently, in her world, unicorn pajamas make you a neighborhood sheriff." But Hannah wasn't satisfied. She started taking pictures of us with her phone, muttering things under her breath about maintaining community standards and suspicious activity. She walked around the moving truck like she was conducting some kind of forensic investigation, scribbling notes on that clipboard of hers. Other neighbors had started peeking out their windows and doors, clearly curious about what was happening. But nobody came over to actually help or introduce themselves. There was something in the air that felt tense, like everyone was waiting to see how this would play out. The whole situation escalated when Hannah began questioning every single item we were moving. "What's in that box?" she demanded, pointing at a clearly labeled computer equipment container. "Why do you have so many electronic devices? This seems excessive for a residential property." The way she said it made it sound like owning a gaming setup was somehow suspicious or inappropriate. I tried to stay calm and reasonable, explaining that I worked in tech and these were normal work and hobby items, but she wasn't hearing any of it. She kept writing notes on that clipboard, occasionally taking more photos and making comments about how our activities didn't seem to match what she expected from legitimate residents. Looking back, I should have recognized the warning signs right then and there. The way Hannah talked about having authority, the aggressive way she approached a perfectly normal situation, The fact that she seemed to take genuine pleasure in making us uncomfortable. But I was naive. I thought she was just an overly concerned neighbor who would calm down once she realized her mistake. As she stormed back toward her house, still muttering about procedures and investigations, I turned to Tyler and said, "Well, that was weird, but I guess we can get back to moving in now." I thought that was the end of it. I was so wrong. 30 minutes later, just as Tyler and I were getting back into our moving rhythm, we heard sirens approaching the neighborhood. The sirens grew louder, and Tyler and I exchanged looks. Something didn't feel right. "Please tell me that's not for us," Tyler muttered. But we both had the same sinking feeling. The sound kept getting closer and actually turned onto our street, and my heart started racing. I felt this weird mix of disbelief and dread washing over me. Surely Hannah hadn't actually called the police over a completely normal moving situation, right? But as the police cruiser pulled up right in front of my new house, I realized that yes, she absolutely had. Tyler sat down the box he was carrying and looked at me with wide eyes. "Dude, this is insane," he whispered. "What kind of person calls the cops on someone moving into their own house?" I was asking myself the same question, but I was also starting to feel genuinely angry. This was supposed to be one of the best days of my life, and Hannah Miller had managed to turn it into a nightmare with her paranoid delusions. The fact that she'd actually involved law enforcement in her fantasy made everything feel so much more serious and threatening than it had just minutes before. Officer Marcus Johnson stepped out of the car, a tall African-American man in his 40s who looked like he'd been doing this job for a very long time. Hannah came rushing out of her house, still in those ridiculous unicorn pajamas, waving her clipboard around like she was directing traffic.
"Officer, thank goodness you're here," she called out dramatically. "I've been watching these individuals engage in highly suspicious activity for over an hour now." Her dramatic accusations were so ridiculous that I almost wanted to ask for her
autograph. What struck me most about Hannah's performance was how genuinely convinced she seemed to be that she was some kind of hero protecting the neighborhood from dangerous criminals. She wasn't just putting on an act. She really believed that Tyler and I posed some kind of threat that required police intervention. The disconnect between reality and her perception was so extreme that it was almost fascinating if it hadn't been so infuriating. She kept referring to her clipboard like it contained crucial intelligence about our criminal operation, when in reality it was probably just random notes about perfectly normal moving activities. I felt my face get hot with embarrassment and anger. This woman had actually called 911 on me for moving into my own house. Officer Johnson approached us calmly, asking what we were doing here today. Before I could even answer, Hannah launched into the most elaborate and dramatic explanation I'd ever heard. She painted a picture of Tyler and I as some kind of criminal masterminds conducting an elaborate heist in broad daylight, referring to her clipboard notes like they were crucial evidence in a major investigation. "Officer, these individuals have been systematically removing items from this property under the guise of a legitimate moving operation. Their behavior patterns are highly irregular and suggest potential theft in progress." The way Hannah described our activities made normal
moving sound like the crime of the century.
According to her version of events, the fact that we were carrying boxes from a truck into a house was somehow evidence of criminal intent. She claimed that our coordination and systematic approach were red flags that no legitimate homeowner would display. She even suggested that the music Tyler had been playing was some kind of distraction technique designed to cover up our illegal activities. It was so absurd that I found myself wondering if Hannah actually believed what she was saying, or if this was all some elaborate performance designed to make my life difficult. Tyler and I just stood there, listening to this insane interpretation of normal moving activities. and I had to admire Officer Johnson's professionalism because he kept completely straight-faced throughout Hannah's entire performance. When she finally finished, he turned to me and asked to see some identification and documentation for the property. I pulled out my driver's license, the closing paperwork, my keys, and even the welcome packet from the real estate agent. Officer Johnson examined everything carefully, and I could see the exact moment when he realized this was going to be one of those calls. "Ma'am," Officer Johnson said to Hannah in a tone that was polite but firm, "these gentlemen appear to be the legitimate owners of this property. All their documentation checks out and they have every right to be here." But Hannah wasn't ready to give up. Hannah started her usual act, but this time it was all too much. She started insisting that the papers had to be forged, that no one could purchase a house that quickly, demanding that Officer Johnson conduct a thorough investigation before allowing us to continue our alleged moving activities. Her desperation was becoming more obvious by the minute, and I could see Officer Johnson's patience starting to wear thin. That's when I learned something interesting about Hannah Miller. Officer Johnson's expression changed slightly when she kept arguing with him and he said, "Miss Miller, haven't we discussed the importance of being absolutely certain before making emergency calls?" Apparently, this wasn't Hannah's first time calling the police for questionable reasons. The way Officer Johnson said it suggested that Hannah was already on their radar as someone who made frequent unnecessary calls to law enforcement. This revelation made me realize that what I was experiencing wasn't an isolated incident, but part of a pattern of behavior that had probably been going on for months or even years. Other neighbors had started emerging from their houses by this point, and I could see a mix of reactions on their faces. Some looked genuinely concerned, but others were rolling their eyes or shaking their heads, and I got the impression that this wasn't the first time they'd watched Hannah create drama. Out of thin air, an older woman from across the street came over and introduced herself as Claire Roberts. She was a retired family lawyer with kind eyes and silver hair, and she immediately stepped in to vouch for me. "Officer Johnson, I can confirm that this young man is the new owner of this house," Claire said, with the kind of authority that comes from decades of dealing with legal matters. As Officer Johnson got back in his car and drove away, I thought the drama was finally over. Hannah retreated to her house, muttering under her breath about looking into this further and verifying with the proper authorities. Claire stayed for a few minutes to apologize for Hannah's behavior and to officially welcome me to Willowbrook Gardens. "Don't take it personally," she said, with a sympathetic smile. "Hannah's been going through a rough time lately, and she sometimes gets a little overzealous about neighborhood security." Claire's warning about Hannah looking into things further should have scared me more than it did. But hey, what's the worst that could happen, right? I thought the police incident would be the end of my troubles with Hannah Miller. Boy, was I wrong. A week later, I came home from work to find an envelope taped to my front door with official HOA violation notice written across it in bold red letters. My heart sank as I opened it up, expecting maybe a minor issue. Instead, I was slapped with ridiculous fines for things like a chair seen through a window, my doormat being too black, delivery boxes on my porch, and house numbers being 1/4 inch off center. The total over $350 in fines for essentially existing in my own home. The feeling of violation was immediate and overwhelming. Here I was barely a week into home ownership, and someone was trying to make me feel like I was failing at being a proper neighbor. Each violation notice felt like a personal attack designed specifically to make me question whether I belonged in this community. The language was formal and intimidating, but the issues themselves were so petty that I couldn't believe anyone would actually waste time documenting them. It felt like being bullied by someone with official-looking paperwork, and the psychological impact was more devastating than I'd expected. What really got to me wasn't just the money, though. $350 was nothing to sneeze at. It was the realization that someone had spent time walking around my property looking for flaws, documenting everything they could possibly criticize. The thought of Hannah prowling around my house with that clipboard, taking notes on the angle
of my house numbers and the color of my doormat made me feel exposed and vulnerable in a way I'd never experienced before. This wasn't just about HOA rules. This was about someone trying to systematically destroy my sense of peace and security.
in my own home. I stood in my driveway reading these violations over and over again, trying to process the sheer absurdity of what I was looking at. I'd been living in the house for exactly 1 week, and somehow I'd already managed to rack up more fines than some people get in parking tickets over an entire year. Every single violation felt petty and deliberately targeted, like someone had walked around my property with a magnifying glass, looking for any possible reason to write me up. The worst part was wondering what my new neighbors thought of me. Were they looking at these violation notices and assuming I was some kind of problem resident who didn't respect community standards? The isolation hit me harder than I'd expected. In my previous apartment, I'd never had to worry about neighbors scrutinizing my lifestyle choices or filing official complaints about my personal belongings. Now, I found myself second-guessing every decision, wondering if the way I parked my car or the timing of when I brought in my mail might somehow violate some obscure community rule I'd never heard of. The dream of homeownership was supposed to represent freedom and stability, but Hannah Miller had managed to turn it into a source of constant anxiety and self-doubt. That evening, I walked over to Claire Roberts' house to ask her about the HOA situation. Claire invited me in for coffee and explained the neighborhood politics with a weary tone of someone who'd been dealing with this kind of drama for years. Hannah has appointed herself as the unofficial compliance officer for our HOA, Claire told me, shaking her. Our actual HOA president, David Park, is too conflict-averse to stand up to her when she gets on these crusades. Hannah's been targeting people she doesn't like with these violation notices for months now, but here's the twist that made everything click into place. I wasn't the only one. Claire pulled out a folder full of similar notices that other neighbors had received. Mrs. Chen got fined for having non-standard garden gnomes. The Johnson family received a violation for their children's bicycles being visible in their own garage. The Rodriguezes got hit for putting up Christmas lights 2 days before the official community-approved date. Every single violation seemed designed to target normal people living normal lives in their own homes, while Hannah's own property violated half the rules she was enforcing on everyone else. Seeing those other violation notices was both relieving and infuriating. On one hand, I realized that Hannah's harassment wasn't personal. She was an equal opportunity bully who targeted anyone she could intimidate. On the other hand, I was angry that an entire community was being held hostage by one person's need for control and attention. The fact that other families had been dealing with this same treatment for months made me realize that someone needed to stand up to Hannah, or she would just keep escalating her behavior until she drove everyone away who didn't fit her narrow vision of what the neighborhood should look like. I decided to attend the next HOA meeting to dispute these violations. The meeting was held in the community center, and about 20 neighbors showed up. David Park, the HOA president, was a soft-spoken man in his 50s who seemed genuinely uncomfortable with any kind of confrontation. When we got to compliance issues, Hannah stood up with a thick folder and launched into what can only be described as a presentation about maintaining community integrity. He spoke about property values and community reputation like she was addressing the United Nations about international security concerns. When Hannah finished her presentation, I stood up and politely introduced myself as the new resident who had received the 4 violation notices. I explained that I was confused about some of the citations, particularly since I'd researched the actual HOA bylaws and couldn't find several of the rules that my violations were supposedly based on. Hannah immediately went on the defensive, interrupting me to say that new residents often struggled to understand the established community standards and that people who challenge established procedures might not be suitable for the Willowbrook Gardens lifestyle. The dismissive way Hannah spoke to me in front of the entire community was humiliating and infuriating. She wasn't just disagreeing with my questions, she was questioning my right to live in the neighborhood at all. The implication that challenging her authority somehow made me unsuitable for the community felt like a threat disguised as official policy. I could feel my face getting hot with anger. But I also felt this growing determination not to let her intimidate me into backing down. If Hannah wanted to play games with official procedures and community standards, I was going to make sure I knew those rules better than she did. As I was leaving the community center, Hannah approached me with that same clipboard she'd been.
"Carrying the day I moved in, Mr. Harrison," she said, in a tone that was trying to sound professional, but came across as threatening.
"I want you to know that I'll be conducting a comprehensive inspection of your property next week. I think it's important that we get you properly integrated into our community standards as quickly as possible." The way she said comprehensive inspection made it sound like she was planning some kind of military operation against my front yard. That's when I realized Hannah wasn't just annoying, she was dangerous, and I was about to find out exactly how dangerous. After Hannah's thread about conducting a comprehensive inspection, I realized that being polite and reasonable wasn't going to solve this problem. Hannah Miller had essentially declared war on me, and if I wanted to live peacefully in my own
home, I was going to have to fight back. But I'm a game developer, which means I think systematically about problems.
I was playing a game of HOA Battle Royale, and I wasn't about to lose. This wasn't just about installing some cameras and hoping for the best. I approached Hannah Miller like she was a complex coding problem that needed to be systematically debugged and solved. Every interaction with her was data to be analyzed. Every violation notice was evidence of her patterns, and every escalation was an opportunity to gather more intelligence about her methods and motivation. I realized that Hannah had been getting away with her behavior because most people approach the conflict emotionally, but I was going to approach it like the strategic war. It actually was. My first move was strategic. I set up cameras, motion sensors, and everything to keep track of her every move. But this wasn't just random surveillance. I positioned each camera to capture specific angles of interaction, installed motion-activated recording devices that would document any trespassing, and created a digital filing system that would automatically timestamp and catalog every piece of evidence. I was building a case the same way I'd build a complex software system, methodically, thoroughly, and with multiple redundancies to ensure nothing important got lost. If Hannah wanted to conduct inspections, I was going to document every single second of her behavior. I also created a dedicated folder on my computer where I could organize all of Hannah's violation notices and create a timeline of her harassment activities. Each violation was entered into a spreadsheet with date, time, claimed violation, actual Hay Rule referenced, and photographic evidence of whether the violation actually existed. I was treating Hannah's harassment campaign like a project management problem, and I was going to solve it with the same systematic approach I'd use for any complex technical challenge. But here's where things got interesting. A little bit of careful investigation revealed some very disturbing information about my neighbor's recent history. The more I dug into her background, the clearer it became I wasn't just dealing with a crazy neighbor, but a dangerous one. Hannah had gone through a bitter divorce 8 months earlier, and according to public court records, she'd lost custody of her 6-year-old daughter due to what the judge described as increasingly unstable behavior during the divorce proceedings. What made this discovery truly chilling was realizing that Hannah's escalating behavior wasn't random or spontaneous. It was part of a pattern that had been building for years. The court documents painted a picture of someone whose need for control had gradually consumed every aspect of her life, destroying her marriage, her relationship with her child, and now threatening to destroy the peace of an entire neighborhood. I wasn't just dealing with someone having a bad day or going through a rough patch. I was dealing with someone whose psychological issues had already caused significant damage to the people closest to her, and who had now turned that same destructive energy toward me and my neighbors. Even more revealing was Hannah's history. With homeowners associations, Claire Roberts helped me contact the HOA president from Hannah's previous neighborhood. And here's the bombshell. Hannah had been formally removed from her volunteer position there after multiple complaints about her aggressive enforcement tactics. She'd been targeting specific residents with excessive violation notices, conducting unauthorized inspections, and creating so much drama that several families had actually moved away just to escape her harassment campaigns. This information helped me understand Hannah's psychology in a way that changed my entire approach to dealing with her. She wasn't just a difficult neighbor, she was someone who used HOA authority as a way to feel powerful when the rest of her life was falling apart. Losing custody of her daughter and being removed from her previous HOA position had probably made her desperate to find another way to control her environment. I was just the unlucky person who happened to move in at the wrong time and become the focus of all that displaced anger and need for dominance. Tyler Brooks, my contractor friend who'd helped me move in, turned out to be incredibly valuable in this situation. When we reviewed his dash cam footage together, we discovered something absolutely incredible. Tyler's camera had picked up audio of Hannah talking to another neighbor right after Officer Johnson left that first day. In the recording, you could clearly hear Hannah saying, "I don't care if his paperwork checks out. I don't like his type in our neighborhood, and I'm going to make his life hell until he decides to leave." This recording was pure gold because it proved that Hannah's harassment campaign wasn't based on legitimate HOA concerns. She had admitted on camera that she was targeting me for personal reasons and that her goal was to force me out of the neighborhood. Tyler and I made multiple copies of this recording because we both knew this was exactly the kind of evidence that could end Hannah's reign of terror once and for all. While I was building my case against Hannah, she was escalating her own campaign against me. The comprehensive inspection she'd threatened turned out to be even more ridiculous than I'd expected. Hannah showed up at my front door with 2 other neighbors she'd somehow recruited, all of them carrying clipboards and cameras like they were conducting some kind of official government audit. They spent over 2 hours measuring things with rulers, taking photographs of perfectly normal household items, and making notes about alleged violations that ranged from the absurd to the completely
fabricated.
Hannah's inspection team found fault with everything from the height of my mailbox to the way I'd trimmed the small tree in my front yard. The total fines from this single inspection exceeded $800. And Hannah made it clear that this was just the beginning. But Hannah made a crucial mistake during her inspection. She was so focused on trying to intimidate me that she didn't notice I was recording everything. My security cameras captured her entire team trespassing on my property and making threats about legal action they had no power to take. That evening, I sat down with Claire Roberts to review all the evidence I'd gathered and plan my next move. Claire's legal background was invaluable in helping me understand exactly what Hannah was doing wrong. Hannah's been getting away with this behavior because most people don't know their rights, Claire explained. She's counting on you being intimidated by official-sounding language and fake authority, but everything she's doing is harassment.
I had the evidence, I had the plan. Now I just needed the perfect moment to end this once and for all.
The more I investigated Hannah Miller's background and activities, the more I realized that her harassment campaign against me was just the tip of the iceberg. Working with Claire Roberts and some of the other neighbors who had been targeted, I started to uncover a pattern of behavior that went far beyond petty HOA violations. What I discovered made me realize she wasn't just a nuisance. She was a ticking time bomb ready to explode. Claire's legal contacts helped us access public records that revealed some very disturbing information about Hannah's financial activities. Turns out Hannah wasn't just stealing my peace, she was stealing actual money from the HOA. Over the past 10 months, Hannah had been submitting invoices to the HOA for various professional consultation services, totaling over $6,000. These were for services like property compliance assessments and neighborhood security evaluation. The problem, Hannah had no professional qualifications for any of these services, and none of the other board members had actually authorized her to provide them. Even worse, we discovered that Hannah had been using HOA funds to pay for her personal, legal expenses related to her custody battle with her ex-husband. She'd submitted invoices for legal consultation regarding community standards enforcement that were actually payments to her divorce attorney. She'd also billed the HOA for security equipment that turned out to be personal surveillance devices she'd installed around her own property to monitor her neighbors' activity. The financial irregularities were just the beginning. As we dug deeper into Hannah's activities, we found evidence that she'd been selectively enforcing HOA rules based on her personal feelings about individual neighbors. She'd been keeping detailed files on certain residents, including photographs of their properties, notes about their daily routines, and even information about their personal relationships and family situations. Most disturbing of all, we learned that Hannah's previous neighborhood hadn't just removed her from the HOA board. They'd actually filed a restraining order against her after she began stalking and harassing the family that had replaced her in the HOA leadership position. The restraining order documented months of escalating behavior, including Hannah following family members to work and school, leaving threatening notes on their property, and even confronting their young children when they were playing in their own yard. But Hannah wasn't finished with me yet. When she learned that I was asking questions about her HOA activities, she decided to escalate our conflict to a whole new level. She filed a formal complaint with the city, claiming that my security cameras were violating privacy ordinances and that I was using them to stalk and intimidate her. She also submitted a complaint to the county sheriff's office, claiming that I was harassing her and that she felt threatened by my aggressive behavior. Hannah's strategy was clearly to overwhelm me with official complaints and legal threats, hoping that I'd be too intimidated to continue fighting back. She'd probably used this same strategy successfully against other neighbors in the past. For a few days, I have to admit that Hannah's strategy worked. Getting official notifications from the city and county was stressful and intimidating, even though I knew her complaints were baseless. But then I remembered Tyler's dashcam recording of Hannah admitting that she was targeting me for personal reasons and planned to make my life hell until I moved away. I remembered all the other neighbors who had been bullied into silence by Hannah's tactics. I remembered how excited I'd been about finally owning my dream home, and how that excitement had been replaced by constant stress and anxiety because of one person's need to control everyone around her. The investigation into my privacy complaint was resolved quickly once city officials reviewed the actual camera footage and confirmed that none of my cameras were pointed at Hannah's property. The sheriff's investigation also concluded that there was no evidence of harassment or intimidation on my part. In fact, both investigations ended up creating official records of Hannah's tendency to file false complaints, which would prove very useful in the final confrontation that was rapidly approaching, as I prepared for what I knew would be the decisive battle with Hannah Miller. I realized that this experience had changed me in ways I hadn't expected. I'd always been someone who avoided conflict. But dealing with Hannah had taught me that sometimes you have to stand up for yourself. Not just for your own sake, but for everyone else who's being victimized by the same bully. I was about to show Hannah what a real plot twist looks like. Hannah's false complaints had backfired spectacularly, but she still had one card left to play. She called an emergency HOA meeting and announced that she was going to formally request that the board take action to remove me from the community due to my pattern of disruptive behavior. This was her final gambit, and she was confident it would work because she'd been building relationships with certain board members for months. The emergency meeting was scheduled for a Thursday evening, and word had spread throughout Willowbrook Gardens that there was going to be some kind of dramatic confrontation. By the time I arrived, the room was packed with more neighbors than had attended any HOA gathering in recent memory. Everyone knew that this was going to be the decisive moment that would determine whether Hannah's reign of terror would continue or finally come to an end. Hannah had clearly prepared extensively for this meeting. She traded her usual unicorn pajamas for a professional look navy blue blazer and had prepared a formal presentation complete with printed handouts and visual aids. She looked like she was presenting a case to a board of directors, and I could tell that she was confident this performance would convince everyone that I was the villain in our ongoing conflict. Hannah stood up and launched into what can only be described as a masterful performance of manipulation and misdirection. She presented a timeline of incidents involving my property, painting me as an aggressive, uncooperative newcomer who had consistently violated community standards and refused to accept guidance from established residents. According to Hannah's version, I had disrupted neighborhood harmony by installing unauthorized security equipment, intimidated long-time residents by questioning their authority, and created a hostile environment through my pattern of surveillance and confrontational behavior. Hannah's presentation was convincing because it contained just enough truth to sound credible while completely distorting the context behind every incident. Several neighbors spoke up to support Hannah's version of events, talking about how peaceful the neighborhood had been before I arrived. Some seemed genuinely convinced that I was the problem, while others were clearly just afraid of becoming Hannah's next target. But then it was my turn to present my side of the story. I stood up calmly and thanked everyone for giving me the opportunity to address the issues. I started by presenting Tyler's dashcam recording from the day I moved in. The audio quality was crystal clear, and you could hear Hannah's voice saying, "I don't care if his paperwork checks out. I don't like his type in our neighborhood, and I'm going to make his life hell until he decides to leave." The room went completely silent as people processed what they'd just heard. Next, I presented documentation of Hannah's financial misconduct with HOA funds. I showed invoices she'd submitted for fake consulting services, evidence that she'd used community money to pay her personal legal bills, and records proving that she'd been systematically embezzling from the Homeowners Association for months. The most damaging evidence was the documentation of Hannah's history in her previous neighborhood, including copies of the restraining order filed against her and court records detailing her increasingly unstable behavior. As I presented each piece of evidence, I could see the mood in the room shifting. Neighbors who had been nodding along with Hannah's presentation were now looking at each other with shocked expressions. Hannah tried to fight back by denying everything and claiming that I had orchestrated an elaborate conspiracy to destroy her reputation, but her protests sounded desperate and unhinged. The final nail in Hannah's coffin came when several other neighbors finally found the courage to speak up about their own experiences with her harassment campaigns. Mrs. Chen described the stress and anxiety she'd felt after receiving multiple violation notices. The Johnson family talked about how their children had been afraid to play in their own yard because Hannah was constantly watching. One by one, neighbors stood up to share stories that painted a picture of systematic bullying. and intimidation that had been going on for over a year. David Park called for a vote on removing Hannah from any official or unofficial role in the HOA, and the result was unanimous. Every single person in that room voted to strip Hannah of any authority she'd claimed over community affairs. The board also voted to conduct a full audit of HOA finances and to pursue legal action to recover the money Hannah had embezzled. Hannah's reaction to this complete repudiation was both predictable and disturbing. She stood up and screamed at everyone in the room, calling
us ungrateful and promising that this wasn't over.
But everyone could see that her power was completely broken. The meeting ended with neighbors coming up to thank me for having the courage to stand up to Hannah. For the first time since I'd moved to Willowbrook Gardens, I felt like I was actually part of a real community. Justice felt sweet. But the real surprise came 3 days later. The aftermath of Hannah Miller's downfall was even more satisfying than I could have imagined. Within 72 hours of the emergency HOA meeting, Hannah's entire world started falling apart in the most poetic way possible. The HOA's financial audit revealed that Hannah had embezzled over $8,000 from community funds. The evidence was so clear that the HOA board had no choice but to file criminal charges against her for theft and
fraud.
Hannah went from being the neighborhood's self-appointed sheriff to facing potential jail time in less than a week. But the legal troubles were just the beginning. Her ex-husband's attorney had been monitoring the situation, and the HOA incident became crucial evidence in their ongoing custody case. The court records from our emergency meeting, combined with testimony from neighbors about Hannah's harassment campaigns, demonstrated that her mental health issues were getting progressively
worse.
The judge ruled that Hannah's behavior showed she was still not capable of providing a stable environment for her daughter, and her visitation rights were further restricted. Even more damaging to Hannah was the fact that word of her behavior had spread beyond our immediate neighborhood. The story of the Unicorn Pajama HOA Karen started making rounds on local community forums, and Hannah became a cautionary tale about what happens when petty authoritarianism goes too far. Her reputation was so thoroughly destroyed that she couldn't find support anywhere. The financial pressure from legal fees and restitution payments forced Hannah to put her house on the market within a month. She'd already been struggling financially. Due to her divorce and custody battle, and the additional costs made it impossible for her to maintain her mortgage payments. Watching Hannah pack up her belongings and load them into a moving truck was surreal, considering that just 2 months earlier she'd been trying to force me to do the exact same thing. What made Hannah's departure even more satisfying was who ended up buying her house. The new owners were the Morales family, a young Latino couple with 2 small children who represented exactly the kind of diversity that Hannah had been so determined to keep out of our neighborhood. Miguel Morales was a software engineer like me, and his wife Carmen was a teacher at the local elementary school. Their kids were adorable and energetic, and they brought exactly the kind of positive energy that Hannah had been working so hard to suppress. The Morales family's housewarming party became the biggest community event Willowbrook Gardens had seen in years. Nearly every neighbor attended, and it felt like we were celebrating not just new residents, but the end of an era of fear and intimidation. People were laughing and talking freely for the first time in months, and you could feel the collective relief that Hannah's reign of terror was finally over. My own life had been transformed by the experience of standing up to Hannah Miller, the shy, conflict-averse guy who had just wanted to quietly enjoy his new house, had discovered that he could be a leader when the situation demanded it. My neighbors elected me to the HOA board with unanimous support, and I was able to help implement new policies that focused on building community rather than enforcing arbitrary rules. The experience also led to some unexpected opportunities. in my professional life. Word of how I'd systematically documented and defeated Hannah's harassment campaign spread through local networking groups, and I started getting job offers from companies that were impressed by my analytical approach to problem-solving under pressure. The confidence I'd gained from confronting Hannah translated into being more assertive and effective in my career as well. But perhaps the most important change was in my relationship with my neighbors and my sense of belonging in the community. What had started as my dream house in an exclusive neighborhood had become something much more valuable, a real home in a place where people looked out for each other. Claire Roberts became like a grandmother figure to me. The Johnsons invited me to their kids' birthday parties. Mrs. Chen taught me how to grow vegetables in my backyard garden. Tyler Brooks and I started a monthly game night that became one of the most popular social events in Willowbrook Gardens. Looking back on the whole experience, I realized that Hannah Miller had actually done me a favor, even though that certainly wasn't her intention. Her harassment campaign had forced me to find inner strength I didn't know I had to build relationships with neighbors I might never have met otherwise, and to learn that sometimes you have to fight for your right to live peacefully in your own home. The final chapter of Hannah's story came about 6 months after she moved away. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that she'd tried to pull similar tactics in her new apartment complex, but her reputation had preceded her, and the management company shut down her complaints immediately. She'd been evicted after just 4 months for violating lease terms related to harassment of other tenants. It seems that once people know what to look for, Hannah's patterns of behavior are pretty easy to identify and stop. As I sit here writing this story, I'm looking out the window of my home office at the beautiful neighborhood I fought to be part of. The Morales kids are playing in their front yard, Mrs. Chen is tending to her garden gnomes, and David Park is walking his dog past my house with a friendly wave. This is what community is supposed to feel like: safe, welcoming, and full of people who respect each other's right to live their lives in peace. So that's how I defeated my HOA Karen, not with anger or aggression, but with patience, evidence, and a little help from my friends. Hannah Miller learned the hard way that karma is real and that bullies always eventually meet their match. If you're dealing with your own neighborhood tyrant, remember that you have more power than you think. Document everything. Know your rights. Find allies, and never let anyone make you feel like you don't belong in your own home. Sometimes the quiet guy with a laptop can be the most dangerous opponent of all. And justice, while it might be delayed, is never truly denied. Subscribe now and dive into even more chaos, laughs, and jaw-dropping tales.